Hi boys and girls, good to see you again. I'm going to be reading again from the Lives of Musicians, Good Times, Bad Times, and What the Neighbors Thought. And today we're going to be focused on Mozart. So remember, so far we've read about Vivaldi and we've read about Bach. So Mozart came after Bach. We're kind of going in a sequential order here of a timeline. So Mozart was born in Salzburg, Austria in 1756, and he died in Vienna, Austria in 1791. So if you don't know where that is, get a globe, get a map, look up where it's at, okay? It's in Europe. I'll give you that hint. It's in Europe. So he had a very short life. And he wrote many symphonies and operas. Some of his famous ones that maybe you've heard of, The Magic Flute and Don Giovanni. All right. So this is a caricature of Mozart. And here we go. Until he was 3, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was an ordinary baby. But then he began to climb up on the bench and imitating the clavier, which was an old-fashioned piano. And he would playing of his talented older sister Maria Anna. So he would imitate what he heard her doing. At the age of 4, he had made up his own compositions and studied the violin. So take a look at a 4-year-old sometimes if you have a brother or a sister or a neighbor. It's pretty young to be doing those kinds of things. He insisted that all his activities be accompanied by music. His father noticed that it was difficult to teach him music because he seemed to know everything already. By the time he was 5, he would stay up late practicing by candlelight. The next year, 6-year-old Mozart went on tour. That's right, traveling by stagecoach all around the bumpy roads of Europe. From all of his travels, Mozart eventually learned to speak 15 languages. He played for royalty, for the well-known musicians of the day. He played in bars or clubs, whatever you want to call them. And at 7, he proposed marriage to Marie Antoinette, the future Queen of France, which, just because he had a crush on her. At 8, he was composing symphonies, and at 11, he composed his first opera. So he was around your age, if you're in 6th grade, 5th or 6th grade, when he composed his first opera. When composing, Mozart wore an apron to keep the ink off from his clothes, because remember, they didn't have ballpoint pens back then. They had the kind of pens that you had to dip in the ink, so it could be very, very messy. He wore little velvet coats with lace ruffles and gold embroidery and a little gold sword on his side. He was known then as the most kissed little boy in Europe. Today, we think of him as the greatest musical prodigy who ever lived. And if you don't know what prodigy means, look it up. But what I'm describing here, the kinds of things that he was doing at such a very, very early age, that it defines a prodigy. They're way beyond just talented, okay? To be doing those kinds of things at that age is very rare indeed. Mozart had a strange and exhausting childhood. He was often ill, that some people worried about how much longer he would live. He was sweet and affectionate and most anxious to please. His special talent meant he never had to go to school because his dad taught him at home. Mozart especially liked arithmetic and covered tablecloths and wallpaper with rows of figures. So apparently they allowed for his creativity. I would not suggest doing that at your house. Mozart loved animals. He sent the family dog, a terrier named Bimperl, greetings from cities all over Europe. In London, he broke off a concert to run after a cat that had wandered in. Later in life, he owned 2 other dogs, a pet grasshopper, and various birds. As a child, Mozart was cute. He had rosy little cheeks and bright eyes. And as an adult, though his skin was yellowish, scarred from smallpox, that was a disease that people got back then as well. We don't get smallpox anymore. We had a vaccine and people don't get it anymore. And his blue eyes were bulgy. He was short and thin, and his head was too big for his body. Yet, he was concerned about his appearance. He took care to have elegant clothes and a barber work on his hair much more often than most people did. Mozart fell madly in love with Alicia Weber, cousin of composer Carl Maria von Weber, the landlady's daughter. But she rejected him, so he married Constance Weber, her sister. Constance was like Mozart in many ways. Musical, not especially attractive, and he called her Little Mouse. And playful. They had 6 children, but only 2 lived until adulthood. It's kind of sad. Music was the one thing that made Mozart's face light up. He usually woke up at 6, composed until 9, gave music lessons until 1, though he did not enjoy teaching. He needed to do it to make money. Then he would have lunch at someone's house where he had to entertain the host. Then, unless there was a concert to attend, he composed far into the night. He could get by on as little as 4 hours sleep, and that is something else that is a characteristic of prodigies. They don't seem to require much sleep. Doctors told him he needed to get more regular recreation, which may be why he eventually bought a pool table. So I guess they had pool back then. Kind of cool. The dogs are joining us. He wrote music more quickly than almost any other composer in history, and sometimes put things off until the very last minute. I guess he was a procrastinator. If he had to work through the night, Constance would tell him tales about Cinderella or Aladdin to keep him awake. His best ideas came when he was in a good mood, alone, and undisturbed. That makes sense. What a delight this is, I cannot tell, he once wrote. All this inventing, this producing, takes place in a pleasing, lively dream. He could write down his ideas at meals. He loved liver dumplings and sauerkraut. I think those are like German-type foods. While gossiping with friends and even while playing pool. Once he held his wife's hand during childbirth, and with his other hand he wrote several pieces of music. So I guess he could double task. One day a visitor found Mozart and his wife dancing in their house, and Mozart explained that they had run out of firewood and were trying to stay warm. Mozart spent money faster than he could earn it, and he was always in debt. Part of the problem was that the aristocrats paid him for music with things like watches and snuff boxes, so they didn't pay him with money. Not the cash that he needed to live on. A letter that he wrote asking for a loan sold 2 centuries later for 100 times the amount he had pleaded for. So again, I'm going to say that they found a letter, and it was in Mozart's handwriting where he had asked for a loan. And then 200 years later, somebody bought it for 100 times more than what he was asking for. There were plenty of people who did not like Mozart. They thought he was rude, immature, and irresponsible. One person who knew Mozart said that she never heard him say one serious thing. He could be impatient with people who were not as bright as he was. Although his father was always bombarding him with advice on how to make money and meet the right people, Mozart had trouble finding and keeping jobs. Once he lost a court appointment by being obnoxious and got himself literally kicked out of court. "There is the door. I will have nothing more to do with such a villain," said the man who fired him. Mozart was scared of ghosts and loud noises, and he was very superstitious, which explains his reaction to the tall, mysterious stranger who came to his house one night. Dressed all in gray, this stranger commissioned him to write a requiem. And a requiem is the music for a funeral or a mass, so when somebody has passed away. The stranger would never give his name, but kept nagging Mozart to finish. Fearful and convinced somehow that he was writing his own burial music, Mozart worked feverishly. Eventually, the stranger revealed to be a messenger from an eccentric count who had a habit of having well-known composers write something he could pass off as his own in private performances. So it had nothing to do with Mozart dying. It just, I'll say it again, it was an eccentric count who had the habit of paying well-known composers to write something, and then he would use it and play it at his house and pretend like he'd written it. So that's called, what's that called? It's called plagiarism or stealing. But by that time, Mozart had died of kidney failure and malnutrition. Mozart had spent 14 years of his short life on the road, and he'd never been very healthy, and he was only 35 when he died. It's very young. Some people feel that the fear of the stranger hastened his death. Plays, operas, and movies have been written about the theory that he was poisoned by rival composer Antonio Salieri, but this rumor was never proven. Okay, so at the peak of his career, Mozart earned as much money in one concert as his father earned in a year. That sounds like somebody else too, you remember? Antonio Vivaldi made more than his dad. Yet at the time of his death, he owned very little. He had 6 coats, 5 red, his favorite color, and 1 white for court, 3 silver spoons, and 346 books. His most expensive possessions were his walnut piano and his pool table. Okay? So here's just a couple little snippets, like trivia about Mozart. To play all of his music in a row, if you were to sit down and play everything that he wrote in his entire life, would take 202 hours. And as I said earlier on in the series, if he were alive today, he would be making $20 million a year on the sale of his recordings. More recordings of Mozart's music are bought today than recordings of any other composer's work. So, boys and girls, if you get a chance, you can go to Pandora and you can listen to some music by Mozart. I hope that you've enjoyed this story, and there's more coming.